Hello, everybody. You're reading with Jimmy, and this is Jimmy. And we're reading Beowulf, the epic poem, early English poem, translated by Burton Raphael. And we're reading part 6 of 8 parts. So we left off, Beowulf had just killed Grendel's mother, was rewarded by Hrothgar, the Danish king, with gifts, and he was going back to his own country. Chapter 27. And then the band of Geats, young and brave, marching in their rank-locked armor, reached the shore. The coast guard saw them coming and about to go, and he'd seen them before. He hurried down the hillside, whipping his horse, but this time he shouted no challenge. He told them only how the Geats would be watching, too, and would welcome such warriors in shining mail. Their broad-beamed ship lay bobbing at the edge of the sand. They loaded it high with armor and horses and all the rich treasure that it could hold. The mast stood high and straight, overheaped up wealth, Hrothgar's and now theirs. Remember, Hrothgar gave him a lot of stuff for killing those monsters. Beowulf rewarded the boat's watchman who had stayed behind with a sword that had hammered gold wound around its handle. The weapon brought him honor. And then the ship left shore, and it left Denmark, and it traveled through deep water. Deck timbers creaked, and the wind billowing through the sail stretched from the mast, tied tight with ropes, and did not hold them back, and did not keep the ring-proud ship. Remember, he's using words with hyphens to describe what's going on all the time. The ring-proud ship. We're going to talk about that in the analysis, the use of hyphens. But if you've ever seen movies of Viking ships, the prow ring, they got these long, arching, round, ring-like wooden beams on the front of their ships. From foaming swiftly through the waves, the sea currents across the wide ocean, until they could see familiar headlands, cliffs that sprang out of the Geatish soil. Driven by the wind, the ship rammed high on the shore. Harbor guards came running to greet them, men who for days had waited and watched for their beloved comrades to come across the waves. They anchored the high-bowed ship, see the hyphen again, moored it close to the shore, where the booming sea could not pull it loose and lead it away. And then they carried up the golden armor, the ancient swords, the jewels, brought them to Hilglick's home, that's Beowulf's uncle, their ring-giver's hall near the sea. The ring-giver is usually a hyphenated word used to mean the king of that particular country, where he lived surrounded by his followers. He was a famous king, Hilglick, with a fitting high hall and a wife, Hygd, young but wise and knowing beyond her years. She was Harith's daughter. And here we go again, ladies and gentlemen, with what? With genealogy. Remember, genealogy is important in these tales and these epics. A noble queen with none of the niggardly ways of women like Thyrth. So he's comparing his daughter to these people from here. Hyd gave the Geats gifts with open hands, but Thyrth was too proud, an imperious princess with a vicious tongue, and so fierce and wild that her father's followers averted their eyes as she passed, knowing that if anyone but their king watched where she walked, her hands would shape a noose to fit their necks. Sounds like a mean lady, huh? She would lie. Her father's lieutenants would write out her warrants, and he who had stared would end his life on the edge of an ancient sword. And how great is sin for a woman, whether fair or black, to create fear and destruction, for a woman who should walk in the ways of peace, to kill with pretended insults. The narrator doesn't like this lady, does he? But Hemming's kinsman tamed her. Hemming, another genealogy. His hall guests told a different story. and spread the news that Thirth had forgotten her gory tricks once her wise father had sent her to a wedding with Opha and married her to that brave young soldier and sent her across the yellow-green sea to that gold-adorned champion, a fierce fighter in war and peace. They praised her now for her generous heart and her goodness and the high and most noble paths that she walked, filled with adoring love for that leader of warriors, her husband. He was a man as brave and strong and good, it is said, as anyone on earth, a spear-bold soldier who knew no fear, exalted with gifts, victorious in war, a king who ruled his native land wisely and well. Emmer was his son, Hemming's kinsman, Garmund's grandson. There's another name, a powerful swordsman in his warrior's shield. So we get a little genealogy as Beowulf and his Geats hit back in Geatland. They're in Geatland. And then Beowulf and his men went walking along the shore down the broad strip of sand. The world's bright candle shone. What do you think that is? The world's bright candle shone. I would say that's the sun. Isn't that a nice way of saying it? Hurrying up from the south. It was a short journey from their ship to Hilglich's home to the hall where their king. Organthro's killer. You see how they use adjectives to describe Hilglich? Lived with his warriors and gave treasures away. They walked quickly. The young king knew that they were back. Beowulf and his handful of brave men come safely home. And so he sat now, waiting to see them to greet his battle comrades when they arrived at his court. And they came. And then Beowulf had bowed to his lord, Hilglich, and standing in front of the throne had solemnly spoken loyal words. Hilglich ordered him to sit at his side. He who survived sailed home victorious next to his kinsman and king. And mead cups were filled, and Harith's daughter took them through the hall. You see that practice of the queen taking them throughout the hall and giving everyone a drink? She carried ale to her husband's comrades. Hilglich, unable to stay silent and anxious to know how Beowulf's adventure had gone, began to question him, courteous but eager to be told everything. So Hilglich says, "Beloved Beowulf, tell us what your trip to the far-off places brought you, your sudden expedition on the salty waves." See that? Remember, Beowulf left suddenly? Your search for war in Heorot? Did you end Hrothgar's hopeless misery? Could you help that glorious king? Grendel's savagery lay heavy on my heart, but I was afraid to let you go to him. For a long time I held you here and I kept you safe, forced you to make the Danes fight their own battles. But God be praised that my eyes have beheld you once more unharmed. So from this speech, it looks like Hilgich tried to keep Beowulf from going, but Beowulf went, which is an important fact in the analysis. Beowulf spoke, Ethgro's brave son. That's Beowulf. See how they use those adjectives afterwards? My lord Hilgich, my meeting with Grendel and the nightmare battle that we fought are known to everyone in Denmark, where the monster was once the uncrowned ruler, murdering and eating Hrothgar's people, forever bringing them misery. I ended his reign. I avenged his crimes so completely in the crashing darkness that not even the oldest of his evil kind will ever boast, lying in sin and deceit, that the monster beat me. I sought out Hrothgar first. I came to him in his hall, and when Helfendine's most famous son heard that I had come to challenge Grendel, who's this? This is actually Hrothgar, right? He gave me a seat of honor alongside his son. His followers were drinking. I joined their feast, and I sat with that band, as bright and loud-tongued as any I've seen. His famous queen went back and forth, hurrying the cup-bearing boys, giving bracelets and rings to her husband's warriors. So they not only gave drinks to the guests, but they gave them gifts. I heard the oldest soldiers of all calling for ale from Hrothgar's daughter's hands, and Freya was the way that they greeted her when she gave them the golden cups. And Hrothgar will give her to England, gracious Froda's son. Froda. That sounds familiar. Froda. Hobbit. Frodo Bear. I'm not saying that. She and that ripening soldier will be married. The Danes' great lord and protector had declared, hoping that his quarrel with the Hothobords can be settled by a woman. So remember, these were clans, they were always arguing, and he's giving, right? Hrothgar will give her, Freya, to England, gracious Frodo's son. Now, why is Beowulf telling Hilglith this? So Hilglith can keep up with the gossip of genealogy. And ladies and gentlemen, it's not important to draw a diagram of the genealogy, but just to know that genealogy and who marries who and who's quarreling with whom is important to these people in this epic poem. He's wrong. How many wars have been put to rest in a prince's bed? So Beowulf is saying that doing this, giving the lady to Froda's son, is wrong. Few, a bride can bring a little peace, make spears silent for a time, but not long. England and all his men will be drinking in the hall when the wedding is done, and Freya is his wife, and the Danes will be wearing glimmering armor and ring-marked old swords, and the princes and people will remember those treasures and will remember that their fathers once wore them, fell with those helmets on their heads and those swords in their hands. So it'll be fine. Everybody will think about it, but nothing much is going to change. Chapter 29. And seeing their ancestral armor and weapons, England and his followers will be angry. So Beowulf is kind of predicting or saying what he thinks is going to happen. And one of his soldiers, sitting with ale in his cup and bitterness heavy in his heart, will remember war and death, and while he sits and drinks, his sharp old tongue will begin to tempt some younger warrior, pushing and probing for a new war. That sword, that precious old blade over there, I think you know it, friend. Your father carried it and fought with it the last time he could swing a sword. The Danes killed him, any more of our men, and stripped the dead, and many more of our men, and stripped the dead bodies. The brave, bold Danes. One of the princess's people here now might be the murderer's son, boasting about his treasures, his ancient armor, which ought to be yours by right. Bitter words will work in a hot-tempered brain. This is important. Surprised Jimmy didn't mark that. Bitter words will work in a hot-tempered brain, pushing up thoughts of the past. That's interesting that this is written like this, even in these days, right? Because sometimes people don't forget whatever they think was done to them that's a wrong or whatever. I remember once I was listening to a relative, names will go unmentioned, and I asked my wife, I says, when did that happen that he was talking about? My wife goes, about 25 years ago. I go, holy mackerel. Pushing up thoughts of the past, and then when he can, calling his father's name, the youngest will kill some innocent Dane, a servant, and bloody sword in hand, he will run from the hall and knowing his way through the woods. But the war will begin as he runs to the sounds of broken oaths, and its heat will dry up England's heart, leave him indifferent to the Danish bride. Hrothgar may think that the Hrothbords love him, loving Freya, but the friendship can't last, and the vows are worthless. But of Grendel, you need to know more. You need more to know everything. I ought to go on. It was early in the evening, so he has this little sidebar of this little family feud. I called it a sidebar. And then he gets back to the story of Grendel, which he's telling his uncle. But of Grendel, you need to know more to know everything. So I ought to go on. It was early in the evening, and Heaven's jewel had slid to its rest. Heaven's jewel. What's that? That's the sun. And the jealous monster planning murder came seeking us out, stalking us as we guarded Hrothgar's hall. Honshu, sleeping in his armor, was the first Geat that he reached. So this is the man, the first one that Grendel, and the only one that Grendel killed that night. Honshu, and he's mentioning his name here because he's telling his uncle the name of one of the Geats, right? Grendel seized him, tore him apart, swallowed him down, feet and all, as fate had decreed. As fate had decreed. Isn't that interesting? As fate had decreed. A glorious young soldier killed in his prime. And yet Grendel had only begun his bloody work, and he meant to leave us with his belly and his pouch both full. And Heorot, that's the hall, right? Remember, Heorot is the hall, half empty. Then he tested his strength against mine, hand to hand, and his pouch hung at his side, a huge bag sewn from dragon skin. So that's pouches where he would put the bodies that he would eat later, worked with the devil's skill. It was closed by a marvelous clasp. The monster intended to take me, put me inside, and save me for another meal. He was bold and strong, but once I stood on my feet, his strength was useless, and it failed him. The whole tale of how I killed him, repaid him in kind for all the evil he'd done, would take too long. And your people, my prince, were honored in the doing. He escaped, found a few minutes of life, but his hand, his whole right arm, stayed in Heorot. Remember, he hung it up from the ceiling. The miserable creature carropped away and dropped into the bottom of his lake, half dead as he fell. And when the sun had returned, the Danes' great king poured out treasure. He repaid me in hammered gold for the bloody battle that I fought in his name. And he ordered a feast, and there were songs and the telling of tales. And one ancient Dane told of long dead times, and sometimes Hrothgar himself, with a harp in his lap, stroked its silvery strings and told wonderful stories. A brave king reciting unhappy truth about good and evil. Good and evil, ladies and gentlemen, is what this epic poem is about. We're going to analyze that. So he would pass the harp. So it was stringing a harp. I don't know if it was like the music we know, but the harp has a few notes, and he would tell stories. And sometimes he wove stories on the mournful thread of old age, remembering buried strength and the battles that it had won. So he's older. Remember, Hrothgar is older. He's often described as what? Gray-haired, yes. He would weep, the old king, wise with many winters, remembering what he had done once, and what he had seen, and what he knew. And so he sat the day feasting, and then darkness fell again, and Grendel's mother was waiting, ready for revenge, hating the Danes for her son's death. And the monstrous hag succeeded, burst boldly into Heorot, and killed Escher. Remember that, right? That was one of the king's oldest and wisest soldiers, his best friend. But when the sun shone once more, the death-weary Danes could not build a pry and burn his beloved body, lay him on flaming logs and return ashes to dust. Why? Because she had carried away his corpse and brought it to her den deep in the water. Hrothgar wept for many of his men, but this time his heart melted. This was worse, the worst. Why was it the worst? It was his best friend, and he had no body to bury. He begged me in your name, half weeping as he spoke, to seek greater glory deep in the swirling waves, to win still higher fame and the gifts that he would give me. So down into that surging lake I sought and found her, that horrible hag, fierce and wild, and we fought, clutching and grasping, and the water ran red with blood, and at last, with a mighty sword that hung on the wall, I cut off her head. Now, see, we read all this, but the narrator, through Beowulf, is reciting this to tell Hilglith and also to remind people about what just had happened. And the repetition, I should write that down, repetition is important in the telling of tales. We'll talk about repetition. So he just recited the whole story in a couple of paragraphs, right? So with a mighty sword that hung on the wall, you remember that, he cut off her head, and I had barely escaped with my life. My death was not written. And the Danes' protector, Hrothgar, Halfdane's great son, right? That's the same thing as saying Hrothgar, but he says it by the son. Hold on, 1 second. Sorry. Why won't it do this? I wonder. Hold on. There we go. Okay. Heaped up treasures and precious jewels to reward me. Chapter 31. He lived his life as a good king must, and I lost nothing, none of the gifts my strength could have earned me. He opened up his store, gems, armor, and he let me choose as I liked, so I could bring his riches to you, my ruler, and prove his friendship and my love. Your favor still governs my life. I have almost no family, Hilgith, uncle, almost no one now but you. Sorry. Then Beowulf ordered them to bring in the boarhead banner, the towering helmet, the ancient silvery armor, and the gold-carved sword. Remember, these were the precious gifts that were given to Beowulf, right? Okay. This war gear was Hrothgar's reward, my gift from wise old hands, and he wanted me to tell you first whose treasures these were. Hrothgar had owned them. Now, here comes more genealogy. Why? Because that's important to these people. His older brother, who was the king of Denmark until death gave Hrothgar the throne. But Hrothgar kept them and would not give them to Hereward, his brave young son, though the boy had proved his loyalty. And these are yours. May they serve you well. And after the gleaming armor, 4 horses were led in, 4 bays, swiftly and all alike, and Beowulf had brought his king horses and treasure, as a man must, not weaving nets of malice for his comrades, preparing their death in the dark with secret cunning tricks. This is important. Why is that important? Because it explains what type of people these are and why Beowulf is different. Hilgith trusted his nephew, leaned on his strength in war, and each of them intent on the other's joy. See, this is important. And Beowulf gave Withlau's gift, her wonderful necklace, to Hilgith, Hilglith's queen, and gave her also 3 supple, graceful, saddle-bright horses. And she received his presents, and then wore that wonderful jewel on her breast. And so Ecgo's son, Beowulf, proved himself, and did as a famous soldier must do if glory is what he seeks. If glory is what he seeks. And that's what Beowulf wanted, right? Fame. Not killing his comrades in drunken rages. His heart not savage, but guarding God's gracious gifts, his strength, using it only in war, and then using it bravely. God's gracious gift is Beowulf's strength. And when he sat in their mead hall and their lord was making men rich, he held no claim on the king's goodwill. They were sure he was lazy, noble, but slow. The world spun around. He was a warrior more famous than any, and all of the insults were wiped out. Think about, I want you to reread this for a second with me. He held no claim on the king's goodwill. They, who's they? They were sure he was lazy, noble, but slow. They didn't think much of Beowulf, even though he's the killer of monsters. The world spun around. He was a warrior more famous than any, and so all of the insults were wiped out. And then Hilglith, protector of his people, brought in his father's, Beowulf's grandfather's, great sword, worked in gold. So here's Hilglith bringing in Beowulf's grandfather's sword. None of the Geats could boast of a better weapon, and he laid it in Beowulf's lap. And he gave him 7,000 hides of land. Hide seems to be the way you measure it in acres. Houses and ground and all. Geatland was home for both king and prince, and their fathers had left them buildings and fields, but Hilglith's inheritance stretched further, and it was he who was king and was followed. So Hilglith is rewarding, his uncle is rewarding Beowulf with all this land, right? He's giving him a lot of things as well. You've been reading with Jimmy. This is Jimmy. We're reading part 6 of 8 parts of Beowulf, the epic poem, translated by our friend Burton Raphael. Pardon me. So learn more about Beowulf by watching and reading the last 2 videos, and you be sure to read other classics on our website. Many, many classics. We're adding them all the time. Lots of hours to enjoy. And remember, if you have any questions, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Send me your emails. I'm glad Beowulf's home. And if you think that's the end, think again. There's one more monster to deal with. I'm just telling you. That's a little foreshadowing from yours truly, Jimmy. Bye.